So I'd like to offer you some resources in learning perspective, and really no knowledge is ever complete, but there's also quite the big danger of overlearning certain things that really we don't use very much as artists. When I was starting out, I was trying to get this incredibly technical understanding of everything because that's just how I knew to learn, and it really wasn't serving me, and it really didn't improve my actual drawing and my actual work. It improved my understanding, but really I don't even remember most of that stuff because I never use it. I was trying to do projections and all kinds of things like that the same way that an architect might be drawing. It was just too much technical information. Whereas for what we're looking to do here, for art, for design, for things like that, really we just need the bare bones of theory. We don't need very much. What we need to rely more on is the practice, because we're coming up with ideas. We're not necessarily trying to get something to be technically and structurally 100% correct. So perspective is essentially responsible for two different things. It's responsible for the camera, or the observer if you prefer. If you are in the scene, depending on if you're looking through your eye or if you're looking through a lens, perspective is essentially emulating both of those. I choose to say camera because really perspective can emulate different camera effects. You can actually create a world the way that a camera would see it. You can have a shorter focal length or a longer focal length. Your eye can't really do that. Your eye is kind of fixed, so it's essentially kind of like a fixed lens. So perspective is a bit more flexible than that. It actually offers you different lenses. And then it's also responsible for object building. So first you have your camera, the thing that you're looking through in order to see the scene, and then you build the entire scene also through perspective. You're essentially modeling everything that's in the scene as well. So we'll start with technical perspective, and this is pretty much the theory. You need to have the theory in order to be able to do your practice correctly. So just doing things without the theory is just as bad as doing too much theory and not really practicing enough. In order to ingrain these things, to be freed from the technical, you need to really go through the technical. So theory comes first, technical perspective, learning how and why things work. This is where you get camera from and the rules basically of how to make objects. And the first person I'll start with is Scott Robertson. We've seen him quite a few times in our video. His book is called How to Draw, and it's quite the technical book. If you go through it and you do the exercises and you redo it and over a period of time just keep on coming back to it, keep refreshing your knowledge and updating what it is that you've missed the first few times as you've been going through it. Try and deconstruct some of these objects, try and draw everything from the book, not just the exercises, but you can also do, for instance, some of the just images that are in the book. Try and think of them as basic forms, the basic volume analysis, and then try and do the form deconstruction. Try and also go through and, let's say, look at this and try and figure out where are these parts that I'm not seeing? How is this actually put together? Try and redraw it with the sections and everything else. So I would say that just from Scott Robertson's book, this would be a huge amount of information. Now, the reason why I offer a couple more is that I find it useful sometimes to see similar things. So there's definitely a lot of overlap between Scott Robertson and Marcos Mateu Meister. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. I'm sorry about that again. So we're just going to call him Marcos. So there's a lot of overlap between the two, and they do talk a lot about similar concepts, but sometimes there'll be a different construction, or you might find a shortcut, or you might find something that you didn't really understand the first time. You might find it slightly differently stated, and this might make more sense. So this is why I always choose when it's something complex. Anatomy would be another example of that. I would always get multiple sources and I would look at all of them and try and just wrap my head around. If there's something that doesn't make sense, I'll grab it from here. Or if things are described in different ways, either try and figure out why that is or just choose the way that makes more sense to me. So having options basically, and also getting the same thing multiple times. And finally, this course from Marshall Van Druff, and I saw this years ago. And this is, I think it was filmed at a college. Yeah, that's right. So it's basically just lectures in a college that were filmed. But I remember watching this thing and it was just so well explained, and it provided so many simple constructions for different things. Slightly different teacher, slightly different style, and you'll probably pick up on some things that weren't in the other two sources. So really between these three, you'll probably get a lot of overlap, which is good, meaning that you'll get a lot of reinforced information. You'll probably get multiple ways to do the same thing. And between these three, I would really cut the theory off kind of here. And that's why I offer three things. I offer three things with overlap, just so you don't feel like you've left something out, but you also have enough variety and you don't get stuck like I did in dozens and dozens of different books that show different things, the crazy elaborate constructions in perspective books from 100 years ago. They were just not necessary. I would have rather have spent that time in practice. So we have a second level to our perspective here. Once we have some of the theory under our belts, and again, these levels are cyclical, so you'll be going backwards and forwards, but when you at least understand part of why things look a certain way, when you can deconstruct some of the simpler objects like cubes, spheres, cylinders, when you can do that, it's also time to start building the next level, the feeling form level. And I've also called this sketching perspective because we have technical perspective, and this is the way to do things with this very elaborate construction. But in sketching perspective, it's a bit freer. So you can see that these things are still three-dimensional, but these aren't made on a grid and they don't have a section through them and all those things. They have all of this built into them, but they're really not constructed as elaborately anymore, meaning that the artist has just familiarized themselves with these objects to such a degree they don't need to be constructing each and everything, which is the trap that I fell in when I was starting out. I was essentially under the impression that I must construct everything and very elaborately. You can see this thing, this whole construction, this was supposed to just be this pipe. This was supposed to be this very simple, just couple cylinders fitting together. But because I thought that I'm supposed to make everything in this very elaborate construction to make it correct, then I was caught in this thing for a very, very long period of time. These are great for practice and these must be done, but really you won't be drawing like this first. First you'll be sketching, first you'll be thinking, first you'll be freer, and then if you have to, you'll tighten up with the technical perspective. I was going technical perspective first and never really thinking through things through a more freer way of drawing, through more sketching. Basically my drawing skills were so poor and I really didn't know that they could be improved, that they could ever feel looser and freer, that I just thought that you're supposed to construct stuff. So I never did sketch. So when I found Steve Houston and Glenn Vilppu's work, when I found them on New Masters Academy, and I essentially, like I said before, this was my 10,000 drawings that I did with them. So through that massive amount of sketching, my skills finally caught up and I was able to get freer and to really internalize more of the technical. I still had to do a second pass and a third pass and keep going back through those same resources that we saw here and just constantly polish and get that better so that as I'm sketching, as I'm doing things, I can more quickly figure out what part of the theory, let's say, what part of the construction have I not done here? What is lacking? What have I missed? Have I changed the vanishing point? Have I somehow changed the viewpoint in my scene? The technical perspective helps being able to judge those things better. So this is a constant hopping back between these two of just sketching more freely, going back and tightening up, sketching more freely, going back and figuring out more of the theory that we've missed the first time. Okay, so this is a quick diagram that we're going to go through of how I might attempt to learn to do perspective if I had to start over. Now this would ideally need to be an entirely different video. It's just way too elaborate and way too many things go into this, but just a quick overview of this would be something like this. So first thing, since I'm just starting to learn perspective, I would advise myself to work 80 to 90% from reference, meaning that I probably have nothing to fall back on here. No previous knowledge, no experience, so really in order to build something in the world, it's best to just look at how things are built. Look at how things look in the real world, rather than just trying to come up with things that we really can't at this stage because we just don't have anything to fall back on. So the goal of this wouldn't just be to copy something one-to-one, it would just be to look at how things are constructed, try and deconstruct, try and break them apart, try and deconstruct them like we saw earlier with sections, with all kinds of different things that would explain how an object is put together. You can also draw from reference without having to copy the same exact object. You could look at objects as inspiration, so you could come up with variations on a certain thing. It's still massively helpful to just have reference, to have more things to rely on than just what's in your head. So I'll probably first start with the theory, meaning that I would just, let's say if I've gotten one of the books that I recommended, I'll probably just start with that and not go through the book linearly. So that doesn't mean go page 1, page 2. I would probably just get the book, go through it quickly, meaning just skim it, open the back, open the front, see what the contents are, see all the different concepts that are going to be in the book, what I know, what I don't really know, what's going to be hard, what's going to be easy. So just familiarize and then spend a little bit of time on some of the chapters, see what the core concepts are. At this stage, it will probably just be to just check out what vanishing points are, have a look at how they're established, what they mean, when you're looking upwards, when you're looking downwards, what it is that happens. So just an overview really of camera, how camera works, how viewpoints work. Then I would move into the most basic of construction. So normally they start with things like cubes, with things like cubes that are slightly modified, like they have an edge missing or something like that. Very much structures with just corners primarily, because these are easy to locate with vanishing points. It's simple to draw these out. And I would really go through it and try and construct these as deliberately as possible, meaning go through the entire process of setting up vanishing points, setting up my object, making sure that it is converging. So I would set up the entire grid and where it's supposed to be going to, and then make sure that everything is going to the correct vanishing point, that it is, let's say if I have a multiplied object, that I am correctly multiplying it, etc. I would make sure that I'm doing everything correctly at this stage. So I would go through things as elaborately as possible. I would stick to cubes and prisms, so nothing elaborate, just very basic planar things, just straight cubes or just slightly, let's say, modified cubes, things like that. Individual objects, nothing compound, nothing complex. We're not trying to impress at this stage, and simple orientations. So I would also combine this with sketching of these same forms. So while we're doing these elaborately and we're trying to really plot them and figure them out, I would also start combining this very much with just freehand sketching. So without now the grid and everything else that we had to do with the elaborate construction, I would just try and create some simple cubes again, some simple forms, this time without necessarily going through the entire construction. And the reason for that is, again, familiarizing your brain, because the goal, the ultimate goal, is to be able to fall back on construction where it's necessary, but really to primarily just have internalized the construction, to be guessing. Scott Robertson calls it making educated guessers, meaning people who know the theory, who know the construction, but really they don't have to go through that. They can just try and estimate and are very close in their estimations as to how things foreshorten, how they multiply, etc. So to be able to construct on the fly essentially is the goal. Then planar forms level 2 would be things like this again, but this time just instead of one cube, let's say, we can add something that's interacting with it. So maybe just another structure that's coming out, and maybe it's going upwards, or maybe it's overlapping somehow. So we're starting to combine these things. We have one thing in front of the other, and this is where you'll probably find it useful to, once again, you'll have to fall back on construction. So if you have to, let's say, have a cube that's behind this one and a little bit off to one side or the other, you'll probably have to plot it out exactly where it is on the ground plane in order to be able to position these things. So you see how you'll be falling back onto construction just out of necessity. And at this stage, you can probably start making things like this, like just a very simple room with just primarily rectangular objects. So you can look for apartments and, let's say, things like that, and just start redrawing those. Then we'll get to round forms, and these are going to be very important when we get to figures and things like that, because almost everything there is going to be some sort of a tube, some sort of a sphere. So when we get to organics, these will be very important. And the theory of them isn't very difficult, but it's imperative that you understand how to construct these things. So this is why, again, we have some extra theory here. And as soon as we start understanding the construction, it's time once again to just get the sketching and get some freehand experience doing these same things, drawing, let's say, cylinders and ellipses that are going to different vanishing points, because they really come with an axis that's built into every ellipse. So they become very crucial to get correct, and also they become very helpful when you're sketching mechanical objects or, again, figures and things like that. This arm, for instance, would just come with an axis. These ellipses that will be going through it, they really determine the orientation of this entire cylinder just to this one ellipse. So this is a very important thing to get correct. So these you'll be attempting with no reference as well. So that means once you've understood the construction a little bit, and then you've gotten some ability with freehanding these and sketching them without all the elaborate construction, you can also try and don't use any reference. At some of these stages, you can just put everything away, see if you can make some cubes, see if you can stretch them, see if you can do the same with tubes, with spheres, which spheres are more easy, but let's say you can challenge yourself by saying, okay, well, here's a ground plane. Now, how are these ellipses going to be wrapping around this sphere? So it gets progressively more difficult as you need to get more and more precise with your constructions, with your drawings. Then we get into combos after that, and combos are pretty much putting, let's say, cubes, and then we also have a pinched planar surface over here. We're going to start combining planar surfaces with some curves. So you can see over here now we finally are getting some curves as well in these constructions. So getting more and more progressively more elaborate, but also doing it very slowly. You can see multiple curves over here. So this is the foundation of, let's say, drawing a car or some type of mechanical object. So a curve is essentially a combination of different lines that could have a particular joint between them, right? They could just be corners like this, corner points, or they could be a little bit more of a smoother connection. So when the connection is smoother enough, they just basically turn into a curve. So this is why we call this combos, because we start getting multiple things that we need to manage. So at this stage we have planar level number 3, meaning that we're really combining these things now into more and more elaborate configurations, and we're using curves. So we started with our round forms. Curves are essentially a part of those, but now we start getting some actual curves over here. And again, Scott Robertson and Marcos's book, they have a lot of information on how to draw curves in perspective, how to foreshorten, how to replicate. You can see I've actually been doing this as an exercise when I've been doing these. And again, you can attempt this with no reference, and you can also do so. There's a lot of construction and deconstruction that you can do over here. When you start doing curves and things like that, you can now really more elaborately get in there and try and figure out how objects are put together and figure out the sections of them, etc. A lot of deconstruction is possible at this stage. Deconstructing is our basic form analysis and our form deconstruction. Now that we've started getting a little bit more complex with planar forms and also some basic curves, it's time to try and start getting a bit more in depth with individual forms, with individual volumes. You can start breaking apart more complicated objects into just these individual structures that they're made out of. You can see this image is split up into all of the different parts that make up the figure. There's a volume here for the head. This is a separate little piece for the deltoid. Here's a tube for the arm, and then another one for the forearm. So you can break them out into these simpler structures and do them individually. This way you won't be sabotaged by proportion or other things that might be making the whole thing more complex. We're just focusing on structure, just perspective, thinking through things, converting them into these basic forms, into these things that we've been learning to draw so far. Planar forms, cubes, cylinders, spheres, simple curves, etc. And you can see, for instance, the way that the deltoid is drawn here. This is kind of the Scott Robertson type of thinking that we were looking at before, where we're trying to really understand sections, we're trying to really think of the form and how it's put together. Not just to draw it, not just the outline, but really all of the sections that make up this volume, so that as we can manipulate them, let's say we can make different things, we can change our volume, we can change our forms, and this is what later on is going to allow us to start designing things. It's this type of thinking, but applied to an individual volume, something that's simpler, because this would be pretty complex. This is what our next level of compound forms would be, when we're putting together separate volumes, when we're now trying to make a full object. And a full object, instead of just breaking, let's say, this one piece and doing that for our deconstruction, it's everything here. So this will be multiple curves, it's multiple objects. So this could be something like a cylinder fitting into another bigger cylinder, and it's also tapering, etc. There's all of these things, these more complex sections that make this level a lot more difficult, but really a lot of real world objects or anything that we may want to design is going to probably end up being quite complex. So it'll be a compound form. So this is ultimately the final level where anything goes, really. There could be multiple curves, multiple blending surfaces, multiple blending volumes, etc. And this is the highest level of complexity. And this is just the first pass over all these levels. These, like with everything else, these are cyclical. So you keep going through these, you keep leveling up your practice and your theory. Maybe you get all the way to compound forms and then you realize, hey, you know what? I really don't know enough about cameras. I need to go back just to the very beginning of theory here and get through more understanding of cameras, get to more understanding of how to build stuff, how to foreshorten. I'm really not very comfortable with that. So you'll be constantly going backwards and forwards. In planar forms, let's say, well, what could possibly be here? Creating more complicated modifications, making things more and more elaborate. There are always next levels and more deeper understanding that's available. So you can see the way that these are structured is essentially we have some technical perspective, and then we move over to sketching perspective or feeling form, and then we have combinations of technical and feeling form again. Then over here we're going to have some technical, then immediately we move over into the sketching phase where we try and internalize that information again. So we're constantly going backwards and forwards between more technical, more organic, technical, organic. And then over here when we get to combos and deconstructing and compound, they really need to work together. So in the first levels we're separating them and training them individually. We're varying between them as we need to, because we just don't have enough theory, enough understanding, or enough ability to just freehand things. So we're going between one and the other, just leveling up our mechanical accuracy and our understanding. Then we try and just do more complex things that require both. And then we go back and we do more passes. And here's a final thing here to add is just my progress in perspective over the years. And you can see over here, I've split it into more theory and then more practice, because at the beginning when I started out, I was very caught up in trying to learn things about how things are done in a very complex manner. I wanted to understand all the technicalities, but I really wasn't understanding at the time that that really isn't what's important, and that I actually don't need too much theory, and I need a lot more practice in order to get my brain to speed up and to be able to do things on the fly for me. We started here with the symbolic drawings, so this is everything just flat, no perspective. And then initial tries, this is where we do planar forms level 1. So I've done a little bit of study of theory, and I'm trying to just do very basic planar forms. And I've also combined that with a little bit of rounded forms over here. So simple cylinders, there's a couple spheres over here. So very simple, basic forms like we said. Then over here we get to some technical perspective. So now that I've probably gotten some more materials, and I'm also doing the exercises here from Scott Robertson, trying to also do some simple scenes with the planar surfaces, with some basic curves. This is the combo level. And then here's some more combinations of curves and planar forms, keeping it very simple, very basic, because you can tell from how this looks really, the mechanical accuracy that I have, just the training that I have at this level really isn't sufficient to allow me to do something that's a lot more complicated, because it will probably just get lost with my inability to just draw very well. So this is the combo level as well. And here, this is a deconstruction. This was a design from Feng Zhu, and I was trying to really try and deconstruct this thing, try and figure out the sections of it, try and figure out the vanishing point. So here's quite a wide angle lens that's used here, so this was tricky to do at the time. And also just trying to figure out how these things are made. Here's a top view that I've first drawn on the ground over here that you can see from the shadow, and trying to do these forms, trying to do these perspective constructions that I've struggled with quite a bit. I can see that these lines are not really receding very well. They're not going to the vanishing point exactly. I can see some misalignments now, but at the time this is what I could do, and I've just done tons of these to practice all of these various skills that go into that. Here's a more complex deconstruction here, and this would be now the compound form. This would essentially be our final level in the little schematic that we were looking at in the little diagram. And then this isn't the final level as in, okay, I'm done with perspective. This is just level 1, let's say, or pass number 1 of the entire diagram. So then we go ahead and we redo it again. Here's some sketching perspective or feeling form that I've attempted. This is a very early attempt, but you can see that I'm doing a more organic structure here, but I'm trying to think of the volumes. I'm trying to think of how things are fitting together. There's elements that aren't seen in this image, in this photograph that I was drawing from, but you can see that I've tried to think about the tube of the arm and where it exists in pictorial space, even when we don't see it, because in the photo it was overlapped by this head over here, but I've still tried to figure out where it is. And also the chest over here, the volume for the chest, I've tried to figure these things out even though they're not visible. So you can see this is a very basic initial attempt in doing some more organic perspective, trying to think these things through and not necessarily plot each and every point out, because it would have been impossible. And then with more practice, this is at about the 10,000 drawings level over here, when I've done quite a few passes over all of those perspective levels. And I've also been practicing, like I said, with Glenn Vilppu and Steve Houston, and just doing a lot of more freehand perspective and really trying to get used to all of these alignments and axes, trying to feel form, trying to feel how something is coming towards us, going away, and doing it more on the fly rather than having to plot everything out and do all of these very elaborate constructions. So 10,000 drawings, and this is the type of level that we're getting at over here, that I'm just understanding form a little bit more organically, and I can do things a bit more on the fly. And I'm still doing more passes on technical perspective. These are more studies from Feng Zhu, and you can see I'm trying to think of how things are constructed, trying to have all the vanishing points, all the different elements of perspective, and also constructing these objects, because they are often symmetrical, so you need to mirror things. So it's important to have your grid and everything else when you're doing something like this, because it is a precise structure and you do need to be careful with it in order to make sure that it is receding to the correct location, that it won't look bent or warped, etc. So I've done quite a lot of these, but quick overview of how I've been going through those same levels.